Welcome to the first episode of the Ravi Joseph podcast. I'm Ravi Joseph, and I'm here with Bharath Vallabha. Bharath studied philosophy at Cornell and Harvard and taught at Bryn Mawr College before leaving academia. He currently works as an administrative manager while pursuing philosophy in his personal life. He is interested in how philosophy gets defined and practiced inside and outside academia, and the relation of philosophy to spirituality, and the prospects of global philosophy. He writes about these issues on his blog, The Radiant Path, and we'll have a link to that in the notes below. Welcome, Bharath. How are you doing this evening?
Good, Ravi. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So the topic that I was thinking about focusing on for today was global philosophy, because you've mentioned a lot how that's kind of how you see your overarching philosophical project, and I think it has a lot of relevance to the global situation today. So I was wondering if you could just start out with telling us what you mean by global philosophy and why it's important.
Sure. Thanks. Well, I think so. When I think about global philosophy, I should say, this means different things for different people sometimes. But the way I think of it is, what is it to think about sort of philosophical questions from the perspective of sort of the human sort of species as a whole, right? From a global perspective. So normally philosophy is thought of as concerned with these really abstract questions, like what is the nature of the self? Does God exist? What is the nature of free will, morality, and so forth? And usually the questions themselves are taken to be sort of universal because they're so abstract that they apply to all people. But one of the challenges becomes that all these questions are also sort of culturally nuanced and situated. And so there's a kind of a question of, well, to what extent are the questions uh, framed by different cultures, and to what extent are they, in fact, just the abstractness of the questions you can read off of the globalness just from the abstractness of the questions? Or is it that there's some way in which the way that, say, in the European tradition, asking what is the self, is that the same question as, for example, when that question is raised in the Indian tradition? Does the fact that they're both, you can phrase them both as what is the self, mean that they're asking the same question, or are they asking different questions, or are they asking the same question but inflected in different ways, and so forth? And so what I am interested in is, especially after the end of colonialism in the sort of halfway through the 20th century, as we try to think about, okay, we're all sort of living on this shared planet. Well, what is it to sort of be able to think about these questions from a perspective where we appreciate that scope of, we're all sort of thinking about it. You could be thinking about it from India or America or China or Brazil or wherever, and what kind of things can hold these together. And I think one question in particular that is very, I find particularly interesting is there in fact such a thing as global philosophy once we understand it that way? Is there something that we could say, oh yeah, all of these different cultures and traditions are asking the same questions? Or is it that no, we have to sort of see them in a more situated context, and what we have is a whole bunch of diverse conversations, but not necessarily one mega conversation. So the question of global philosophy that I think of is, it's really a question. The question is, what does thinking about philosophical questions from a global perspective mean? What could it look like? And what are its possibilities?
Yeah, a lot of interesting insights there. Um, the last point that you touched on is one of the things that I was wondering when I was pondering your some of your global philosophy essays is there, like you said, is there maybe a way to completely, or not completely, but to unify all these different traditions and have them talk to each other in a way, but it might be that they're just irreconcilable and just different conversations. And um, the analogy that I had in mind was, let's say, with music. There's a bunch of different musical traditions all over the world. There's jazz and classical and rap and rock. And jazz is kind of my partial favorite. But other people prefer rock, and other people prefer rap. Um, so some people are interested in the project of bridging together jazz and classical or jazz and rap or rap and rock. Um, and that's their calling, but some people are moved to just continue the conversations of those genres in themselves without referring to other genres. Um, so in the same way with philosophy, there could be internal questions to one particular tradition and one other tradition, and some people might be moved to bridge them together. But so I was wondering if that is an analogy that is used, but there's not necessarily in the musical case, there's not necessarily like a singular world music that we're trying to get to, except for people that are interested in various fusions. So how does that sound for you as an analogy for global philosophy and traditions, and where does it work and where does it fall apart? Why, what are the possibilities of fusion versus the possibilities of reconciling, and why do we need to reconcile them, as opposed to just letting them kind of evolve on their own?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great analogy. I think this is something that I've thought about in different ways over time. Uh, I think one of the reasons why it's a great analogy is because one could sort of say, is global philosophy kind of like something like fusion philosophy? So is sort of if we're kind of suppose we're mixing together the European tradition with the Indian tradition, right? Is that something analogous to fusion music, where you sort of get sort of rock or classical, Western classical mixed with classical Indian music or whatever, right? And I think it's a great way to think about the issues because that really brings to the forefront the question of what can global philosophy be? Like, what is it that is even being thought about, right? And I think, is it more that there is this one gigantic global tradition called philosophy, and it just happens to include Plato, Confucius, Shankara, and so on and so forth, and they're all sort of doing the same thing called philosophy, or is it more like these are sort of uh, global philosophy is more like you can take from these diverse traditions and you can mix and match them however you want so that you can sort of have as many people, some people now explore, you could have an Aristotelian Confucian picture, or you could have sort of maybe an Indian sort of philosophy that's merging with, say, sort of American pragmatism or whatever, right? And so you could sort of global philosophy ends up being this mixing and matching things. And I think my sense is that uh, we are more inclined to see the fusion as a bunch of diverse projects in music. We could sort of say, oh, there's the Mahavishnu Orchestra. That's one way fusion can go. Oh, there's, sort of the Miles Davis, the way he did it, or John Coltrane did it, or, there's any number of other, there's some Indian rock bands like Indian Ocean that are doing it where they're mixing together different genres. But we're not thinking, oh, they're all supposed to be somehow taking from the same thing. There's no such thing as, oh, these sort of groups or these genres have to be talking to each other and engaging with each other. When we say pop, there's pop, which is a kind of global mixing together of various kind of traditions. Uh, in philosophy, generally, I think there's a tendency to think that I mean, I feel the tendency in myself. I mean, to think, no, no, there has to be one main thing because after all, what we're concerned with is philosophy is concerned with truth. There's not necessarily sort of musical truth that all these different sort of genres of music are capturing. They're all more expressive, and so it could be more like, okay, people have to find their niche. Somebody might maybe they don't want global music. Maybe they don't want fusion, either in the pop mode or jazz or classical, whatever it is. Maybe they just want to listen to, you know, uh, Frank Sinatra, and that's it. That's the kind of music they like. Or somebody wants to just listen to North Indian classical music, and that's it. That kind of parochialism seems very non-philosophical in one way, because we say, no, no, we want to ask, okay, there's either a fact of the matter or not about whether there is truth in religion or whether we have free will or not. And we're asking these questions where we want these answers. And I think that's sort of how I started thinking about global philosophy when I was a student in college, and I wanted to get beyond sort of what I saw as the Eurocentrism of American philosophy departments, which was still very focused on the Western tradition, and there were all these other traditions that were not being addressed. It's gotten much better now in the last 20 years, but it's sort of like, oh, well, I'd like to see a conversation between the Western tradition and non-Western traditions to sort of together come to the truth of these matters. Uh, and I think that's a very popular way of thinking about global philosophy now, which is sort of, oh, these are these singular questions that we all have just as human beings, and we want to be able to find answers as a shared project. We want to get together people from all traditions coming together to give these answers. I would say that probably in recent years, I have moved away from that way of thinking about global philosophy more into a much more expressivist picture, which is more similar to the music version, where I sort of think, no, one of the challenges of global philosophy is not that, oh, we know what the questions are of philosophy. We just want to find answers that are globally sort of curated, as it were, from all the different traditions. But global philosophy or philosophy from a global perspective is actually an incredible challenge to the very idea of philosophy, in the sense that it sort of challenges us to think, what is this thing called philosophy? What kind of thing is it? What is it? What is even the analogous? What is sort of concepts around philosophy like spirituality or self-discovery? What are these things that we're seeking, such that uh, it could be both somehow incredibly uh, abstract and universal. It applies to 8 billion people, as it were, and which is simultaneously incredibly personal and meaningful and sort of existentially sort of real for each person. Is there anything like that? And I think when I think about philosophy from a global perspective, I think of it more as a set of questions and perspectives that helps us reorient to ask ourselves, as it were, what is it that we're seeking in wanting philosophy, right? And it's not like a one answer or one set of paradigm. It's more like this tension between this universalist picture of philosophy and this expressivist picture of philosophy, and sort of trying to figure out, okay, what does this conversation look like once we think about it from a global perspective? I think that's a nice way to think about it, because it brings out that this tension between this kind of what I'm calling this universal or abstract and opposing it with expressivist is something that's within all traditions as well. It's not like, okay, this is only this, if you're just looking at one tradition, then it's fine. It's in general, uh, philosophical traditions tend to have this tension within themselves and try to figure out, okay, what kind of a communal conversation on these topics are we actually looking for, what is possible, and what kind of possibilities open up for us.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really really interesting series of insights there. So I like the distinction you're drawing between the kind of universalist seeking after this one ideal of truth versus the expressive capacities of all these different projects, as it were, of different musical projects. And I think when I look out at the intellectual scene today, or at least we talked about in previous conversations about this distinction between the academic world and the kind of wild west of the internet. And not being an academic myself, I'm kind of inhabiting this kind of wild west internet world. And when I look at the interesting essays that are happening out there, it really is this kind of expressiveness. Everybody has their own project, bringing just mashing things together. Like there's a video that came out on the internet a couple days ago about bringing Nietzsche and startups together, and um, yeah, all manner of other things like that. Um, so but I like that that kind of not set of conditions, but this kind of like sidebar you put over that um the global philosophy is not an aiming after that one specific thing, but a set of perspectives and orienting questions we can ask about these traditions and questions. Um, so that uh, perhaps as a way of organizing all these different kind of mashup conversations between Aristotle and Confucius, or between yeah, all these other different possibilities that are happening. So what might be some of those kind of orienting principles or frames or perspectives that constitute the global philosophy worldview, or step towards a worldview?
Yeah, that's I'm really glad you asked that question because I tend to think of the reason why I sort of focus a lot on this kind of global perspective is because I think it sort of focuses me to sort of a certain kind of place of vulnerability in my thinking, right? So one of the things that uh, so one of the principles, as it were, that come out for me out of this kind of perspective is that really it's impossible for anybody to have a global sort of, as it were, God's eye view on philosophical traditions around the world, right? So for example, when I got interested in these topics, it was because I became interested in Indian philosophy. Then I went to college and then sort of was studying, um, you know, uh, European philosophy as taught in American, you know, universities. And so for me, global philosophy often had this sort of resonance of trying to bring together the European and the Indian traditions, right? And that is sort of what I was familiar with. Now, even my knowledge of Indian philosophy also is not extensive, right? It's sort of like, so but nonetheless, I was culturally influenced to respect certain Indian philosophers like Shankara, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Jiddu Krishnamurti, others, right? And so these were sort of the people that I sort of grew up thinking, oh, these are who philosophers are, right? Then when I went to college and I sort of got to know Socrates and Descartes, Kant, Wittgenstein, and so forth, then I'm sort of like, oh, these are also philosophers. Now, how are these philosophers related to each other? That became for me a very personal, meaningful question. One of the things that I've had to be aware of, though, is this is a very sort of, from the perspective of the global picture, this is sort of just one entry into that conversation. Nothing in what I've said makes any reference to Chinese philosophy, Japanese philosophy, the various traditions of African philosophy, African American philosophy, philosophies from the Latin America, right? Most of these I have no knowledge of at all, right? I have some, I could, like most people, I've read some introductory books on it. As a relatively sort of educated person, I could get into any of these traditions and read more about them, right? But I haven't actually done that, right? Because I don't think anybody could possibly do that, right? That's the one of the things that the global perspective shatters is the general illusion that people function in when sort of philosophical discussions happen, is that somehow we have transcended to a level of complete abstraction and universality, right? That we're already somehow already there, that we've kind of reached a space where we're kind of speaking just as thinkers, not as a brown man or a white woman or a Chinese person or a African person. No, we've somehow transcended all of that stuff, right? And what my own awareness of what global philosophy, how it meant for me, basically India and Europe, right? Even that very my own local understanding of those traditions uh, brought out that really a lot of our conversations hover in between these two realms of abstract, sort of real abstraction, where we're actually looking at the whole global situation, as it were, and sort of being completely parochial and sort of grounded just in what we are familiar with, what we grew up with, or what we sort of locally identify with. Sort of so I think it brings out a lot of philosophizing is really kind of swimming in this in-between realm where we're trying to get sort of higher, more abstract, but really we're kind of not sure what that would look like. And so one of the things that I think like what you mentioned about the Nietzsche and, I forget what it was. Was it Nietzsche and sort of startup companies or something?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that was
Yeah,
I just watched the beginning of the video, but it was going down that train of thought.
right. So, but I mean, so what that brings out is that really uh, there is kind of a general explosion happening of the ways in which we could engage with thoughts and ideas that are not actually controlled by particular institutions, right? And so part of, I think, the open-endedness of global philosophy has to do with the fact that we don't actually have global institutions, right? And so even the very idea that, for example, there is such a thing as Western tradition of philosophy is to some extent a kind of illusion fostered by the fact of sort of that there are certain institutions that claim that mantle for themselves, like say academic philosophy or philosophy, like philosophy departments in academia in for the last several hundred years, or in the Middle Ages, it would be sort of universities associated in a more theological setting connected to the church, right? So what we have really, there are some people and some institutions who kind of lay claim to a tradition and sort of say, oh, we're kind of continuing this thing, and this is this one thing. And then if that institution has sufficient power in the culture, we kind of people, and if people don't care or they don't have the power to challenge that, they sort of go along with it. You know, part of what is happening now with philosophy from a global perspective is that there are no institutions which can actually lay claim to that as say, oh, we are actually doing this, because we don't actually have global, institutions like that. One of the big questions we're facing in our culture globally is whether people even want such global institutions and what that means, right? And all of the huge tumult we're seeing politically has a lot to do with exactly with that question of what would it mean for there to be global institutions? Do we already have them? Did the left in the last 100 years already create certain kind of global institutions? Is that good? Is that bad? And so I think oftentimes the questions about philosophy get tied up with these institutional questions of who can claim for what, who should listen to what are the power issues at issue here. Uh, and I think it's helpful to sort of see that really nobody can speak to philosophy from a global perspective. That it's like I tend to think of it a little bit like what happened. We're going through a kind of cognitive revolution, similar to what happened in the Enlightenment time, where people sort of when they adopted the Copernican perspective and could sort of see that okay, the Earth isn't at the center of the world. We're actually the sort of the Earth revolves around the sun, and then you expand on this kind of picture of modern physics, and you sort of say, okay, we're kind of actually just a small planet in this vast universe that has uh, millions and millions of galaxies. That shift kind of affects something about how we kind of relate to the world, right? The way we sort of think about the world. And I think part of what a global perspective about philosophy kind of forces us to do is to say that, oh, like we are kind of in a similar position of uh, vastness uh, when we interact with each other as people. Right. The fact that we're sort of globally situated now, the fact that we can talk to people, across the globe on FaceTime or Zoom or whatever, we know exactly what's going on everywhere due to how fast news travels and, Facebook and whatnot. We have all these institutional structures that are not institutional as in world government, but just this kind of technological structure in place. But sort of the modes for interacting across the cultures of these interactions is something that is, we are not remotely in a position to sort of figure out what that means because we don't know. So we have to first accept, no, I don't know if I'm talking to somebody, even if I'm talking to somebody from India. Now I am pretty disconnected from sort of what is happening on the ground in India. As an American citizen who's been here for most of my life now, and who has, there is a kind of disconnect. And that's kind of generally true for when people talk to each other, uh, you know, whether it is within a country or across globally. And so I think that kind of openness to our sort of amazement that we're able to talk to each other at all across this kind of divides is something that taking this kind of global perspective can help foster, right? If we really take it, as opposed to just sort of saying, oh, we've discovered the global perspective. The global perspective is the perspective of science. So we already achieved it. Or I think sometimes that tends to happen in sort of spirituality sort of circles. Oh, we've achieved it because the global perspective is that of, transcendental meditation or self-consciousness or global conscious. You can give names to these things and sort of say, oh, we're achieving it. We've gotten it. Right. But usually these categories are just categories. They don't name anything. They're just meaningful for it ends up back to that question of, is this capturing truths or is this expressive, right? Which is it?
Hmm. Yeah, I like the in several points that you brought up. Um, there's this something that I was also wondering when I was thinking about your project earlier. The inherent contextuality and positionality that's involved with needing to think about these issues. So, for instance, when you were a student, uh, bringing your Indian background and the European education together at the same time, that was a position that raised a certain set of philosophical questions. Um, and in a similar way, somebody at a global institution who needs to adjudicate various cultural claims or something like that, they are require a set of philosophical tools that me sitting in my room don't require. So I was wondering about that in the context of why I don't necessarily in my own life feel these questions pressing on me and just tend to follow what I'm interested in because I'm not always thrust into situations in which these are live questions. So, but on the other hand, just as a part of living in this globally interconnected world, some amount does kind of pressure everybody with the force of their questions. Um, so I was wondering if you could speak to what, if this makes sense, if the relation between where global philosophy is, at what institutional or cultural points global philosophy, thoughts about global philosophy are actually needed versus where conversations can just continue as they are. And does that kind of make sense as a question?
Sure. No, I think that does make sense. So
Yeah.
let me see if I understand what you're saying, right? So
Mm,
there's, you know, so perhaps one thing that I'm saying is sort of like, look, we're sort of, we're kind of, it can seem like maybe what I'm saying is that everybody's sort of stuck in their own bubble a little bit
mm,
because we can't, there is no such thing as a global perspective that we all automatically occupy.
mm,
So then that can make it seem like, well, I'm kind of perspective, you're coming from yours, everybody sort of, and so this could sort of create a kind of subjectivism. We
mm,
can say, well, look, if you can't have this global thing that we do in fact have global conversation that we already are partaking of, then maybe all we're having really is 8 billion conversations, or
Hmm.
maybe 4 billion, whatever, right? But really, just a tremendous amount of personal conversations, and some people get to have a bigger platform, and so we tend to confuse the bigness of the platform with getting closer to truth or something, right? When Elon Musk says something, then for people like, oh, well, this must be really, it must have something because he has millions of followers, and so we tend to the temptation, and and whoever it could be anybody, that it is the temptation to sort of think, well, maybe there is truth really is just what people can get other people on board with, right? And I think that's a very live question. I think it's a very open question of, is that really is that what's happening? And I think I tend to think that I'm not a I guess I'm not a pessimist in the sense of, I think, no, we're all kind of stuck in our own bubbles, and all there is sort of power dynamics. Whoever can get the most followers wins the game of truth, kind of thing. Because uh, really, after all, what is the person winning? What the person might be winning is a lot of followers, sort of they get their projects sort of highlighted and so forth. But that doesn't by itself mean that they have somehow transcended into a greater perspective, right? So if magically I have a million followers, that doesn't make and I just sort of think out loud about what I know, right? And I can sort of keep using global philosophy as as a buzzword for my interests, right? And I say, look, I'm interested in Western philosophy and Indian philosophy, and I'm trying to combine them, and that's global philosophy. And then I have a million followers, and they listen to me, and it can be like, yeah, that's what global philosophy is. But really, in a certain sense, I am trapped by my own sort of. In this case, I would be trapped by my own uh, fame in a certain sense, right? Because I can't get out, and I might think, oh, because it's applying to a million people, maybe the million will become a billion, and then it'll become 8 billion. And then I am actually speaking, I can speak to everybody. Whereas in a certain sense, the pushback from the quote unquote, the world, as it were, to sort of say, no, you're not speaking to everyone, Bharat. You're just speaking to the things that you cared about, and you're trying to put together that kind of pushback from the world and from other people is actually really important for my own personal growth. So in my own case, in my own life, um, when I was 20 or 25, I really thought putting these together was global philosophy. Now I am in my mid 40s. It took me 20 years to sort of realize, okay, no, that's a particular project that I constructed in my sort of late teens and 20s. But there are many people who are also constructing these projects, and they're constructing them in different ways. Even people who are interested in combining Western philosophy with Indian philosophy combine those interests in very different ways than the way I did, right? And so that kind of awareness, though painful, because I kind of like, oh, what, like, I look, all this stuff I don't know. I don't know all this classical Indian philosophy. I don't know medieval Western philosophy. There are lots of things I don't know. So how can I combine these traditions if I don't know the traditions? Is a very kind of painful awareness, right? Um, but in a certain sense, that awareness is also been inseparable from my own sense of personal growth, right? Of like, oh, yes, it's true. I don't know those things. Now, what do I do when I come to that awareness? What can I do? Do I instantly go out and now learn all of that classical Indian philosophy that I didn't learn? Can I learn sort of all the medieval philosophy? Do I learn the Islamic philosophy and the Christian philosophy? Do I learn sort of Chinese philosophy? Do I learn, sort of what was happening in Spain and in Mexico at the, that's what I mean by that is not actually possible, right? There is just a limited number of things, especially if somebody, like me, uh, or you who have day jobs and who are not being sort of like, when I was a professor, I would sort of say, okay, maybe I could do this, right? Because I'm sort of working for this. But of course, even then, that's not true. Even if even if somebody just gave me a bunch of money and said, Bharat, go figure out all this stuff. This is your only task. We'll give you money, healthcare, whatever. You just go figure out this global philosophy stuff. And I have 24 hours a day to read and think for the rest of my life. I will not bridge this gap of what I don't know and the things that I don't know. And so I think part of what part of what I think what it can foster is sort of an awareness that this is our shared epistemic situation. This is our shared situation with regard to knowledge, that we we're all kind of fractured selves talking to fractured selves, and sort of attempts to sort of say, no, we have transcended that, are whether that happens in this in an academic context where we say, oh well, look, we're asking questions that are universal because they're based on some Eurocentric thinkers have thought, no, only Europe has philosophy, nobody else has philosophy, right? Well, that makes the game easy. If the only one tradition has philosophy, then okay, that tradition is what you have to, of course, then it raises the question of what about all the disagreements within that tradition, right? Who can know all of that stuff too? But, or you could sort of say, no, look, take somebody like, uh, you know, uh, some spiritual thinkers, like, Vivekananda or Thomas Merton or Alan Watts. You say, look, Alan Watts, he studied Western thinking and Eastern thinking, and he synthesized it all. He synthesized it into this kind of essence of what it's all about, right? And I think that's really been this is something that we've been talking about, I think, recently, right? But that's been kind of the branding of somebody like Alan Watts. That's been the branding of spirituality in the 20th century, is people who sort of say, no, yeah, you don't have to worry about all of this synthesizing business. I've synthesized it. Like Alan Watts did the hard work. He studied Western thought. He studied scientific thought. He studied, Zen Buddhism. He's done it all, and he's figured it out. And here's what you need to follow, right? And I think my hesitation about that kind of space right now is I'm sort of equally critical of the academic model and of this spirituality model that we have in our broader culture. Both foster this false sense that there is, in fact, we can occupy a space of having synthesized it all, right? And that we need to kind of get to that space of synthesizing it all. Instead, I think we need to sort of really face up to the fact that no, we really are in this kind of space of knowledge where we can talk to each other. Knowledge talking isn't stopping. People are getting to know each other better. People are getting to know themselves better. There are actually these traditions. That's all true. But it's also a really big question of what it means to transcend any of these traditions and to come up into a broader perspective, and that challenge of, oh, like anybody who says they're doing it, my mind immediately goes bullshit. Like, because it's like, no, you're not doing it. You're doing it a little bit from your perspective, but let's talk about all the things that you don't know and being aware of the things that you don't know. And I think we tend to sort of worry about admitting this precisely because it is the Wild West. It's like if it's a cultural Wild West where people are trying to have a platform, people are trying to have a voice, and if saying what you don't know isn't sexy, it doesn't get clicks. So everybody can admit, I don't know all sorts of things. What's the fun in that? right? Like what's so cool about that? If you get out there and you say, I've discovered the fourth level of the higher consciousness, then people are like, oh, there are four levels. You figured out the four, you came to the fourth one. That's great. And then there's somebody like, I'm still stuck at the second one. Now let me listen to you. How do I get to the fourth one? Right. Or somebody else might come along and say, as happens often in academia, well, look, I'm integrating my knowledge with the latest discoveries in neuroscience and social psychology or something. And they're like, oh, well, I don't know any social psychology. Look at this person. This person's figured out what they've synthesized their knowledge with social psychology and say, oh, that's why we should listen to them, right? So there is that kind of tendency to think, oh, it's only by claiming what we know can we get heard, right? And I think in a way that's very natural, but in a way that's also why our public conversations are not really good, because what you have is you just have thousands and millions of people sort of speaking over each other, each claiming to what they know, but not really being open to the fact of it's not what you know that matters, it's being open to what you don't know and being willing to admit it and sort of publicly trying to learn is what's kind of cool, you know. And but I think how that fits into the framework of the new technologies that are emerging, um, that I think is something that is still being worked out.
Hmm. Yeah, we're circling around another topic that I want to talk about. So conveniently, all the questions that I wrote beforehand, the podcast are coming up pretty naturally. Um, So I want to talk about the relationship between the institutional structures that are available in the world right now, both in academia and in this kind of Wild West internet landscape, and how that might relate to the possibilities for global philosophy being articulated. So in your latest blog post, there was this interesting segment about how um, with the relationship between German idealist philosophy and the formation of universities at the phase right before the contemporary university model, where so right now science is kind of the center of the university, but just before that, philosophy was the kind of theoretical center of the university, and how that corresponded to the ideology of German idealism, where philosophy was the kind of queen of all knowledge,
Right.
that kind of unified all knowledge. Um, and so there's this correspondence between the um, the ideology that's at play in the institutional structures. Um, so I was wondering, um, what are the possibilities for global philosophy to be heard in academia as it is, and also in the kind of internet landscape as it is, or are there any other institutions or possibilities you see besides those two places where this kind of synthesis can happen, or this kind of synthesis or advance, or however you might want to think about can happen?
That's a good question. I think so. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about sort of German idealism, and how it went with the university setting was, so here are these people, uh, like Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, these are German philosophers in the early 1800s, who were sort of right at the cusp of, and Kant as well, who are sort of right at the cusp of the sort of the start of what we think of as a modern university, which sort of began in Germany at that time. By which I mean, what makes it modern is that it was sort of university that wasn't theologically centered, and which had, instead of fighting science, the sort of insights of Newton and so forth, sort of embraced science as sort of a good thing, so that we're not trying to sort of, how do you fit that into the theological context wasn't the game. The game was, okay, you know, we sort of accept that sort of our modern scientific revolution of the Enlightenment was great. And what do we now, and how do we now, what does that mean for knowledge? And what kind of institution setting can make that happen? And these thinkers believed that the university was going to play that role, that the church was this kind of unifying structure where you have knowledge, politics, social cohesion, uh, all of these things sort of coming together in the context of, say, the church and the king and the medieval university kind of were together projecting a sense of here is the way the world is, right? And so these German idealists sort of believed that the university was going to play that role, right? And this was kind of a flashpoint of how it looked right at the beginning of the 1800s and that they thought that philosophy would then play this role because science by itself isn't going to tell us sort of how to live our lives. It isn't going to speak to our deeper poetic or sort of artistic tendencies and our sort of artistic expression or to our spiritual inclinations and desires and sort of longings. And so they thought philosophy was going to be the thing that's going to harmonize all of these things together, right? And it did, and as a thing, as a sort of hope, it maybe it lasted 100 years at most. I think it already was sort of being questioned even in the 1800s, but by 1900, I think it's safe to say that the universities were no longer playing that role. By that time, sort of physics, revolutions in physics and math and logic had surpassed anything that most philosophers could, as sort of thinkers can just follow. You have to sort of really be attuned to the insights of that subject to understand those things. And the same is true across the board, whether it is history or economics or sociology. These are all subjects in the modern form that came into existence in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the university, as we think of it, really is just maybe 100, 150 years old, right? And where we sort of, and philosophy departments in universities are not the center. They haven't been for at least 100 years. And what work they're doing in universities is an interesting question if they're not the center. But and now there's a real question that they might actually even be booted out of the university altogether because of in a way precisely that the hope that the German idealists had was that they were going to keep knowledge and social cohesion together in the university. I think what we're seeing now is universities are not really, once you sort of make science the center, that's you're kind of your hands are tied in how to deal with the actual social problems of questions of identity, right? And so now you basically, in my opinion, it looks like universities are kind of being attacked, sort of they're under duress, both from the right and the left, because neither find out that the identity issues they care about are not getting aired in the universities in the way that is meaningful to them. And so that's kind of pushing the humanities very much sort of to the side of the university. I mean, sort of out of the university in a certain important sense. So, but which then raises a question, okay, if the university isn't the place for that, where is a place where we can speak to sort of our shared sort of let us even just say American, like even before we get to global, we could even say in America, where is our shared discourse going to look like about questions of identity, tradition, sort of human longing, our sort of literature, history, philosophy, politics, what kind of thing can bring it all together, right? And of course, the internet revolution has just made this exponentially more complicated in the last 20 years, because now there's also this question of, okay, suddenly you can sort of have form without the university, but then what does that mean for what kind of conversation we can have? And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about our epistemic situation, about what it is, what kind of knowers we are, what kind of knowledge claims we can make on each other. I think my sense is there is not going to be a shared thing. That is kind of what's lost. That's what I mean by saying this is Copernican shift where there is no the ideal of coherence that was sort of assumed in the medieval age in Europe. Um, the German idealists kind of thought, no, okay, we can keep that ideal, but we'll just make it secular, and we'll sort of make it sort of not connected to the Pope, and we'll make it not connected to the king even or a ruler, but that it'll be sort of these epistemic agents, these the scholars who are going to be the people who are going to sort of hold it together, right? And these kind of people like you know, somebody like Leibniz or Goethe or, sort of Hegel, sort of people who seem sort of these encyclopedic thinkers who can sort of hold all sorts of space of knowledge in them. And somebody like Goethe who could be write about sort of vision and optics while also being a great poet and sort of writing, sort of novels while also working with in the king's service and engaged in all these kind of political issues of the day. That combination, I think, gave the appearance of we can hold it all together. There could be people who can sort of play this role of combining all these different aspects of ourselves. And I think where we're at now is no, we cannot do that. That is just not in the cards, right? I think the 200 years ago, at that time in Germany, there were like literally a couple of hundred people who were in this game, who were sort of doing this stuff, right? I mean, maybe it was 1,000 people across Germany or something, but these were not vast. The number of people who were trying to get into the game was not anything like what is happening now, right? And that is the effect of democracy. That is the effect of capitalism. That is the effect of the openness that precisely what global sort of this sense of, oh, we're all one village. Okay, great. Well, but if it's a one village, then really what we have is a cacophony. There is no shared sense of what do we all have in common. What we have is, millions of people sort of speaking their mind, but we're not sure what it means to sort of together create something, right? And I think it's clear that the internet by itself is not going to answer this problem because the internet is just sort of a vehicle for getting people to express themselves. But what do you do? How do you combine it all? I pretty much have no hope that that's going to come from academia. Like it's not going to come from academic philosophy because the institution is already sort of in turmoil. Is it going to come from outside? And I think one of the hopes of the hippie movement of the 60s, for example, was, and I think which has played a very big role sort of in our culture, is, oh, you don't need any institutions. All you need is a rise in consciousness, right? It's like, okay, no, forget, all the institutions be damned. We don't need institutions. All we need to do is somehow touch base with our inner universal self, and then that's going to connect all of us together, right? If we just sort of if we all sort of say no to the sort of bourgeois lifestyle, and we just have our cars and our jobs and our sort of pension plans and whatnot, and that's all if we sort of get beyond that consciousness, then in that level of consciousness we're all going to be unified, right? And that unity happening at that level is going to guide us forward. And I think just from my perspective, that has been, I think, shown to be pretty naive, right? That is, I'm all for growth in consciousness and exploring the further reaches of the human mind and developing all of that. But whatever that is, it isn't something that you can just tap into that way and then millions of people just tap in there and then somehow like, oh, okay, now we're going to stop fighting and stop arguing with each other. Whatever spiritual oneness of human beings can look like, I don't think that is what it's going to look like. But that has played an equally strong role in our culture, that, oh, you don't need an institution like academia or scientific institutions or whatever. You could just need this kind of consciousness. I think that's very unlikely. So that's why I think a lot of people just put their hopes on thinkers like Sadhguru or Eckhart Tolle or whoever. Say, look, we just need enough people like that, and then we just will become like them, and then it'll all be okay. And my thought is, no, it's not going to be okay, because being like Eckhart Tolle isn't going to tell us what to do about artificial intelligence or about nuclear war or about, if aliens come. Like if aliens come, I don't think it's going to be like, great, well, we all live in the now, so it'll be fine. Like, no, there's still the actual question of, what are we going to do about the aliens? What are we going to do about artificial intelligence? What are we going to do about sort of global warming? These are all questions of sort of mass public uh, these are basically sort of projects that have to be undertaken of how to address these issues. So these are kind of engineering and social dynamic projects, right? And so those are not going to be just, and I love somebody like Eckhart Tolle. There are certain times in my life where I really depended on that kind of thing, right? But that's not an answer to all of these kind of questions that automatically are going, that you're not going to go into that space of oneness and then just creatively answers will just come to you of how to address these things. And so it's an interesting question. Well, where then will it come from? And I think part of where it will come from has to be that we have to create new structures for exactly these social dynamic issues. I think some people are hoping that, from what I can sort of read and see, that, well, AI will take care of all this. AI will just synthesize all this stuff for us and, solve all these problems. But given that most of the problems that we are talking about actually tend to be problems of identity, right? There are questions of who I am, like, okay, I can only know some parts of the Western philosophical tradition and some parts of the Indian philosophical tradition. I've been struggling of how to integrate those things that I'm aware of, right? Okay, AI can read all of the Western tradition and all of the Indian tradition, all books written, in both traditions. It might call something an integration. We could ask AI, tell me what is the common answers, within the Western tradition and the Indian traditions, and it'll spout out some answer. It might even be an interesting answer, right? But it might not be an answer that speaks to my identity and my sort of where I'm coming from. So we're still left with the question of somehow, how do we connect these issues to our own sense of identities, where we came from, and where we want to be going? That task is still sort of left for us to figure out and what to do. And that, to me, I mean, that's why I think this issue of admitting what we don't know, admitting how we can talk about what we don't know, uh, becomes, I think, a really important issue. And I think I'll just say one other model that's out there right now, and I think which is what sort of, if you don't have this hippie model or the academic model, right now, the other main model is, I would say, this political model, whether it's a nationalistic model or whether it is sort of a kind of woke model, where it sort of says, no, we sort of moral indignation can be the thing that brings us together, right? Okay, there's all this cacophony of voices, but the thing that can bind us together is, on the one hand, something like, oh, blood and soil. The thing that unites us is the thing that we know what unites us. It's that we have a common shared sort of bond for the kind of people that we are. There's those kinds of people, but then there's our kind of people. That's kind of one temptation, I think, precisely to not face up to our sort of situation, right? And then but on the other side is, no, we don't have to face that situation of open-endedness, because we know what is right and wrong, and sort of you lean into that moral sort of sense of I'm right. I know what's right. Like racism is wrong. I'm just going to lean into that and sort of say an awareness that racism is wrong is what will unite us, and I think that, again, I think it's pretty clear that those are not going to be the things that are going to actually sort of move the conversation forward in a deep way. I think it would have to be that this is kind of why I find the perspective of global philosophy so fascinating is, like with most revolutions in sort of tumultuous times, it requires new vocabularies, new conceptual frameworks, new sort of ways of framing the issues that sort of meet our current time. And I think basically we have to figure out the language for our time. And that requires somehow owning up to sort of the difficulties of our time, right? The fact that, yeah, we all want to live as one village, global village, but we have absolutely no idea how to sort of talk to our neighbor, let alone sort of people across the planet, right? And so what can that look like? What kind of synthesis is possible in this context? I think that's a very big question. And I'll just say one other thing here and I think it's a very big question. What does this mean? Like, is it even possible for the whole globe to somehow live in harmony together? Is that even going to happen? I think one of the really, to my mind, I think challenging, depressing things to think about is that maybe there's not going to be 8 billion people living harmoniously together. Maybe what's going to happen is that a fraction of those people are going to become like super smart cyborg like people who are going to have like memory implants and biological implants, and they're that what the future holds might not be the fantasy of the people that I've identified with, the people from the 60s and the hippie movement and the rock and roll music and the spiritual tradition of the last 50 years, which has kind of promised this kind of had the promise, just like Marxism did, of this kind of global solidarity. And I think that's very much a question on the table now of, okay, is that even going to happen?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's promising questions, I would say, promising thoughts, but at this point, not a lot of we don't concretely know what the structures are going to look like. And I mean, the same with you. When I look out at the landscape, I just see more and more fragmentation, different teachers, different philosophers, different media outlets um, vying for this sort of attention um, and like you're saying, this is only we're still like to only think about the utopian side of things, where how are we going to get from this fragmentation of the content landscape into global way of thinking, but there's also these possibilities of dystopia that I think are um yeah, frightening to think about, but we need to be mindful of how to steer clear of them. Um, so with that, I wanted to pivot for our last question to a very
Sure.
different direction, and this is for the maybe the prospective writers, intellectuals in the audience. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your creative process, because you've been a prolific blogger for 10 years, and a successful academic before that, wrote a lot of articles. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you generate ideas and turn them into finished pieces of writing. Um, so where do the ideas come from? What's your process like of generating an idea into an essay or an article? And are there any helpful creative frameworks that you like to think about?
Uh, that's an interesting question. I would say that my own process reflects some of these issues that we're talking about what kind of shared frameworks we have, and uh, what it means to actually sort of speak to another person, find a commonality. And I would say that I have mainly struggled a lot with those issues. So I've written quite a bit on the blogging in the last 10 years. Uh, Before then, I think like when I was in academia, I actually struggled to publish. I didn't publish. Uh, I wrote quite a bit as an academic, but I never got around to publishing, partly because of these issues of I wasn't sure what it meant for me to identify with what I wrote, right? Uh, and even outside of academia, I would say that I've blogged a lot, and I think sometimes I've placed some of the things I've written on online spaces, public online spaces. Um, uh, but I think I have sort of uh, it hasn't easily translated into, oh, here's a kind of set sort of online magazine that I'm a part of, and then I sort of write for that kind of thing. Um, Usually, I suspect it's because my process of my process of thinking and being creative and writing is sort of um, it's I guess fundamentally it's kind of personal in the sense that I sort of tend to like the way especially once I left academia, it's kind of like, okay, I have to have a job to sort of make ends meet, so that 40 hours a week are taken up by that, right? And then there is sort of the general life issues, of sort of day-to-day life, being sort of, being married, now being a parent, sort of a lot of that gets taken up. Then it's kind of like, okay, so I usually sort of read in the form of audiobooks so that I can sort of catch up on things that I find interesting or whatever while I'm doing the dishes or doing work or, not work, but, housework or whatever, right? And this kind of speaks to that issue of what is our sort of knowledge space. Like, what do you need to be able to speak to something, right? And to sort of be heard. And so for the most part, yeah, I think I keep an eye out for books and ideas and often YouTube videos, podcasts that sort of strike my sort of interest. Uh, just because my interests are so varied and they're sort of all over the place, so they don't automatically easily come together. It's just it's a kind of process of, okay, well, this is happening over here, that's happening over there. I've often thought of it like my interests are like I'm painting a vast mural. Uh, and, I sort of every once in a while sort of think, oh, the left topmost part of this, gigantic painting is kind of taking some shape. We sort of look at the whole painting and it's like mostly blank or it's got the random splotches all over the place. And we're like, but it's kind of working towards something that will make this whole thing mean one coherent thing somewhere down the line. So I'm kind of function with that ideal, but then mostly sort of trying to put all these pieces together. And so uh, writing has been crucial for me as a way to express myself, to figure out that, okay, these ideas do matter, that the thinking matters, and that it's sort of helpful to foster some conversations, like the way like you and I have had meeting in this forum, or me meeting you in the meetup that you ran for many years. Uh, so I think this kind of connection of local connections with trying to sort of aim for something broader while being somehow just grounded in and being honest about what are my problems, what are the things that speak to me, and being open to how much of that can be generalized, when can it not be generalized, when do I just need to listen? And so a lot of that sort of tends to happen in fits and starts. And I think keeping open that, yes, there's a kind of global communal conversation that's happening that I'd like to be a part of. And that conversation might not be obvious. It's not coherent. It's kind of like a block party happening where, where there's sort of thousands and millions of people having this sort of intellectual or block party. And, I think it has mattered to me to be sort of a part of it, and then keep that alive for myself. And I think for others who might find it interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective on creativity that there's this global community and you want to try to find your place and your authentic way of speaking to that, join that conversation. It's a lot of the thinking on creativity can get very kind of solipsistic, whether you're just trying to create your little masterwork in your own little mind, but there's this broader process to connect to and dialogue with. Yeah, those are really fascinating
Yeah, I
conversations.
think that's where it's
Feedback.
kind of like for me, those two things, it's that this kind of academic model and the expressivist model, they kind of keep vying for sort of some tension, right? Where it's like, okay, the academic model is kind of like, okay, it's a
Mm,
group conversation. You don't figure things out by yourself. You kind of write something, there's peer review, you need those other people to tell you what's going on, give you some reflection. But then at the end of the day, it's also like, okay, you need to sculpt that thing the way it is coming to you to sculpt, and that's what you need to do. So
mm, yeah.
yeah.
Great. Well, yeah, that was a really wonderful conversation. A lot of insight for anybody thinking about these issues or similar issues. So thank you, Bharath, for coming in on the podcast. Where can people find your work and think along with you?
So yeah, mainly it will be on my blog. So I guess you might have a link to that. It's
Yep.
the Radiant Path. I sort of blog from time to time. It sort of comes and fits and starts, but it's something that I've done consistently, and that would be the main place to check out any of my ideas.
Great. Well, I send the audience your way. And thanks for coming on and have a great rest of your weekend.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Thank
All
you.
right.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Bharath. Bye.
All right, bye.